This video is sponsored by Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So, if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. Hello everyone and welcome back to another tutorial. As you may notice, I'm very excited because today we're finally doing another episode in the logo animation series, which are by far the most popular videos on this YouTube channel, so thanks to everyone who tuned in and left great comments. If you can't tell already, I'm a huge fan of football. I love playing the game, watching different league competitions, so because of those reasons, this episode's theme is Logo Animations Football Edition. Let's take a look. As you can see, the logos that we're going to be taking a look at today are from different divisions such as Roma, Barcelona, Arsenal, Bayern, and
Paris Saint-Germain.
Or Paris Saint-Germain. However, we will only recreate the Roma logo from scratch because that's my favorite team, and then break down every other logo in detail because the process is pretty much the same. So if you understand the concept with the Roma logo animation, then you'll easily be able to turn any logo into 3D and animate it. The software we're going to use is After Effects with Element3D and Illustrator. I'm aware that Element3D is a third-party paid tool, so I don't assume everyone has access to it, but I also experimented with Blender, which is an awesome and completely free 3D software, and came up with similar results, so leave a comment if you'd be interested in a tutorial about creating 3D logos in Blender. Another plugin I will be using is Overlord. It's also a third-party paid tool that allows you to transfer files from After Effects to Illustrator very efficiently. But keep in mind, you don't need this at all in order to follow along with the tutorial. In fact, you can easily transfer files between the two programs by using built-in features, which I will cover in the tutorial. The project file is available for download on my Gumroad page if you want to dive deeper, and as long as you have Element3D installed, then you're good to go. I'll make sure to leave links in the description for any other materials. As of now, all my project files are using the pay what you want system, so you can grab anything you want for free. But of course, if you're feeling generous, then you can buy me a cup of coffee, even though I don't drink coffee, so bottle of water maybe.
A bottle of water?
Let me know in the comments section what your favorite sport is and what your favorite team is within that sport. I then challenge you to make a 3D logo animation of that team by using what you learn in this tutorial. And if you happen to post it on social media platforms, then make sure to tag me because I love seeing what you guys come up with. This tutorial is a bit long, and I know you don't mind long videos when it comes to learning, but even so, relax, take a deep breath, have a sip of water maybe, and let's go ahead and get started. Here we are now in the computer with our trusty good old friend Google. And before we can do anything else, we first need to find our logo. So we'll type in Roma SVG, and what we're looking for is scalable vector graphics formats, which is what you would usually use for logos and things like that. I'll leave this link in the description so you can get it as well. And then we'll click on the logo, right click, save as, Roma Tut, and hit OK. Then we'll open that file in Illustrator by going up to File, Open. We'll hit Z, zoom in a bit, and then middle mouse button to pan around. If you're not too familiar with Illustrator, then don't worry about it because we're not going to be doing any complex things. But whatever we will be doing, I will make sure to cover it in as much detail as possible. But the reason we're using Illustrator is because, for one, After Effects does not support SVG files. And secondly, we need to clean up our logo a bit first before we transfer it over and have it ready for Element3D. Speaking of transferring files, I'll quickly show you the usual way of doing that. So we'll go over to File, Save As type, Illustrator, Save, and OK. And then back in After Effects, we'll double click on this area to import. import our file, import kind as composition, footage dimensions, layer size, doesn't really matter. And then here we have our comp, so we can double click on it. And then here we have our layer, but as you can see, we don't have access to any of our masks. So the way we can do that is by right clicking, create shapes from vector layer, which will create a shape with all of these contents inside. So we have groups, and inside of the groups, we have paths. Now, one of the downsides to this is that it doesn't retain layer names. So just by looking at this down here, we don't know which is which. Instead, we have to select this and then maybe hit Control T to transform so we can maybe see it. And now we know in the composition that it's this line here. And why is this so important? Well, because we're gonna be transferring these paths into solids later on. Not knowing which is which just by looking at the layer stack is gonna be a big hassle. Another way to copy these shapes over would be by dropping this down and let's say select one of these shapes. So we'll go with number 9 here. Just make sure you target it by clicking this circle icon and then hit Control C or go to Edit, Copy. Then back in After Effects, we can create a new solid. So go to Layer, New Solid, hit OK, and then just hit Control V. And this will create a mask inside of the solid. So if we hit M, you can see there's the mask. We can actually select multiple layers at a time, hit Control C, and then Control V on the solid, and there you go, we can paste all of those masks at once. But just keep in mind that this method also doesn't take into account the names of the layers in Illustrator, so you're gonna have to rename them and also play around with the modes here. So for example, you wanna set all of these to add, and you can see the A letter here, you wanna find the inner mask and set that to subtract. So those are a couple of ways you can do this all built in without having to use any third-party tools. But even so, I'm gonna be using Overlord, which I mentioned at the beginning of the tutorial, which is a third-party paid tool. I won't go into too much detail with this. We will mainly be using these two buttons here, which are the push and pull button that transfer files between After Effects and Illustrator. Now back in Illustrator, we'll quickly rename this to Roma and then drop this down, maybe find some layer, maybe the R letter, and then rename that to R. And back at the top, we'll select the layer itself. And then here we have the Overlord tab and we'll just click the push button. And that automatically brought all of those layers inside of our comp. And as you can see, it retained the layer name. And if we drop down into the contents, scroll down, here we have the R letter as well. Another thing I want to mention is the size at which these files get transferred over from Illustrator. And that is based on the artboard size, which is the equivalent to the composition size in After Effects. And as you can see up here, it says 278 by 360. So we're going to fix that. Back here in Illustrator, we can click the artboard tool. Select one of these corners, maybe hold down Alt to scale it symmetrically, and then hold down Shift to scale it proportionally. And then over there, the corner, you can see it says width and height, but I want to do this in a more precise way. So we'll go over to Window, Artboards, and then double click on this icon right here. And seeing as we're going to be working at 1080p, we'll set this to 1920 by 1080 and hit OK. Now we can hit Z, hold down Alt to zoom out, and then without holding Alt, you can zoom in. And I just want to select all of this, hold down Alt again, hold down Shift, and just scale it up a bit. So this is the same size at which this will be imported over into After Effects. Now on to cleaning up our layers. So we'll select the trademark logo and hit delete. And now we own this logo. Jokes aside, we'll scroll down here and we'll start renaming these base layers. We'll do top orange, bottom red. Then what we can do is target this bottom red layer, then hold down Shift, target the base, which will select everything in between, and then hit Control G to group, and we'll rename this to base. We'll do the same thing with the Roma letters, and then select them, hit Control G to group them, rename this to Roma. Then we'll do the same thing with the numbers, but if we zoom in here, so we'll hide this one, you can see there are duplicates of each number. One of them being this outline stroke, and then the other is the base fill shape. And whoever did this, I don't know why they did it, but we're gonna quickly fix that. So we'll hide the shape with the fill, and then we'll select this outline stroke. And we know it's a stroke because if we increase or decrease the weight here, that'll affect the stroke thickness. So we'll Control Z to undo. And in order to merge these two into one layer, we first need to turn this stroke into an actual path. And the way we can do that is by selecting the layer, going over to Object, Path, Outline Stroke. And this is now a path that we can edit. And then we'll turn these both back on, select both of them, and then over here in the Pathfinder, we can click this Unite button, and that will just merge those two shapes into one, and then we can rename this to 7. So now we have a single shape. Now we can do the same thing with all of these other outlines of the numbers and also the shadows of these numbers. So we'll hold down Control, click on all of those to add to the selection. Then we'll go to Object, Path, Outline Stroke, and then we'll continue merging these. And then finally, select the bottom one, hold down Shift, select the top one, hit Control G, and rename the group. Now finally, let's focus on the characters at the top here. So we got the she-wolf and the two kids. The female wolf with the two infant brothers, Romulus and Remus. Or Remus. Probably Remus. Starting off right at the bottom here, we'll select this one, double click, rename it to she-wolf, which is the base or the outline of this character. Then we'll select it, and then hold down Shift right at the top here, just before we see the kid layer. Click on this target icon, and then hit Control G to group. We'll name this she-wolf. Then we'll select the kid on the right, hold down Shift, just before we hit the kid on the left. Select those, hit Control G, double click right kid. And then do the same thing with the left side kid. And then hit Control G, we'll rename this to left kid. And then all of these other pieces, apart from the very top one, are also part of the female wolf. So we'll group those and we'll do she-wolf top part. Hit OK. And we'll bring this inside of the she-wolf and just make sure it's sitting at the top there. And we'll finally select this path over here and bring it inside of the right kid. Now a couple more things. We'll drop down the kid left. We'll do kid left base and right kid, kid right base. Oh, and you may have noticed there's this path layer, which is the line at the center here. So yeah, there it is. And I believe it is also a stroke. So if we increase that, yep, there you go. So we'll Control Z to undo and go back. And with it selected, we'll go over to Object, Path, Outline Stroke. So it's now an actual path. And there you go. We now have a clean looking layer stack, and it's now time to move over to After Effects. As you can see, I have the original project opened up, which again will be provided on my Gumroad page. And we'll go back to all of these comps a bit later, but for now we'll click on this comp icon, which basically creates a new comp for us. And we'll type in Roma Tut, and we'll make sure this is 1920 by 1080, 30 frames per second, and then hit OK. Now the way the Overlord plugin works is it is going to transfer the files to whatever comp you have open in After Effects. So if we go back to Illustrator and then with the Roma layer selected, hit the push button, it's going to bring everything into this comp with the same size and the same names. So it's very convenient. Now keep in mind, Element does not support shape layers. What we need to do instead is create new solids and then transfer these mask paths from the shape layer into those solids. So we'll go over to Layer, New Solid, and let's say rename this to Base, and then pick the color from that, just for some visual clarity. The color doesn't really matter in this case. Then we'll select the pen tool by either clicking this icon up here or clicking G on the keyboard, and then just create a random mask. Doesn't really matter what this is, but we can hit M to bring up the mask path, and then select this Roma layer. Let's say find the base right down here under the path. We want to select the actual path, and then hit Edit, Copy, or Control C, and then select the path of the base, Edit, Paste, or Control V. And there you go, we now have that same shape on our solid. Now there is a slight issue. If we look down here, we can't really change the mode of the mask, so we don't have any of those options like add, subtract, and that's because this mask is not closed. In order to close it, we can simply right-click, Mask and Shape Path, and then Closed. Then we can duplicate this, and we'll do top orange, hit M, bring up the mask path, and then go down here onto the top orange part, select this path, hit Control C to copy, and then Control V to paste it here. And again, you can't see the modes, so close the mask. Now we'll duplicate this one more time, rename this to bottom red, hit M, and then go down here. So we can just drop this down, select the path, Control C to copy, Control V to paste, right click, close the mask, and that's it. Just keep in mind that whatever objects you want to have control over individually, you're going to have to put them into their separate solids. Now for any layers that contain more than one mask, such as the R letter here, we can drop it down and you can see it has two paths. So we'll select it, hit Control T so we know this is the inner part, and we'll copy that, paste it here, and we'll select the other one, hit Control C to copy, and then Control D to duplicate this. And we'll leave the bottom one as is, but the top one we'll set it to paste. So now the top mask is the outer side and then the bottom mask is the inner side. And what we'll do is set this to subtract. And if we turn this on, you can see that it represents the R letter. This is quite a repetitive task, so I'm gonna go ahead and speed things up a bit here. Dun, 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 dun. And we're done. Alright, so as far as the base, the letters, and the numbers go, I just finished copying those masks from the shape layer to the solids, color-coded the layers, renamed them, reordered them, and even applied the colors on the solids that represents the colors on the logo itself. But the reason I stopped here is because I want to show you something regarding the characters at the top. If we drop this down, so we'll solo it out for a moment, and let's say drop down the she-wolf character. Well, there are so many masks, so it wouldn't really be ideal to copy all of these over one by one to individual solids, and besides, we want this whole character to be one piece. So how do we work around that? Well, first of all, you remember how I renamed this she-wolf, which is the base or the mask that makes up the outline of the character? Well, that's the only mask we're gonna be copying over. We'll drop down the paths, and we'll go over to the top here, we'll duplicate this layer, we'll call this she-wolf base, and then we'll hit the tilde key, which maximizes any viewport your mouse cursor is hovering over. And we'll scroll down, select this second one, which I believe is the outer mask, and then select this, hit M, bring up the mask path, select the mask path itself, again, Control V to paste. Remember, we can't see the modes here, so right click, mask shape closed. And then we'll also copy this first path, which is this hole at the mouth here, and you'll be able to see that in a moment. So we'll Control V to paste, right click there, close it, and subtract. So now if we solo this, turn off this one, you can see this is the outline of the she-wolf, and then over here we have that mask path at the mouth, which makes a hole. Now, what about the rest of the elements? So what about the textures, the lines, and the she-wolf, and all that stuff? Element has a feature which allows us to map a texture onto an object. We're gonna export all of those other elements as an image texture. Now that we're here, we'll select the she-wolf and only the she-wolf. Then we'll go over to File, Export Selection, which will add it to the asset exporter. We'll rename this to she-wolf tut, set the destination, and then set the scale to width and maybe something like 2000 pixels, which is more than enough because we're not going to be zooming in too close. And then maybe set this to PNG format with a transparent background. And finally hit Export Asset, and that will export it and open up the destination. And if we open this up, you can see why we use Illustrator to export this as an image. And that's because it takes into account the size of the layer as a whole and makes sure that the bounding box of the entire image matches the shape of whatever it is we're exporting. And you'll see why this is very important when we get into Element later on. Now we'll do the same thing with the kids because they also have a bunch of masks. So we'll select the right kid. And again, remember, whatever you have selected, that's what it's going to export. So just make sure to do these one by one. So we'll go over to File, Export Selection, Kid Right, Export Asset, and then Left Kid, File, Export Selection, Kid Left, Export Asset. All right, now back in After Effects, let's just make sure we have the kids as well in their own layers. So Kid Right and then Kid Left. Select both of them, hit M to bring up the mask paths, and we'll select both of these, delete them, right kid. All the way at the bottom here, we have kid right base. That's the only thing we need. So Control C to copy that, Control V to paste it here, and just right click, make sure it's closed, and then do the same thing with the left kid. Let's just select them, change the color label to maybe purple. Then we can unsolo them. We'll hide the bottom one, and then we'll select the base all the way to the top, hold down Shift, select the kid right. We'll hit this button, which is the shy button, which means that once we click this button, it's gonna hide any shy layers in the comp. So now we have a clean looking timeline. And with that, we're ready to move on to Element. So we'll go over to Layer, New, Solid, or use the Ctrl+Y shortcut, which I highly recommend that you learn as many shortcuts as possible because they do speed up the workflow a lot. And we'll rename this to Element3D and hit OK. Then I'll click Control Space, which brings up FX Console, which is also a plugin from Video Copilot, but this one is free, and I definitely recommend that you check it out because it allows you to type in the name and then just hit return to add it. And it also comes with a bunch of other features which I won't get into right now. Now, when it comes to Element, the majority of the work is going to be done inside of the scene setup. But before we go in there, we first need to input whatever layers we want to use to extrude in 3D. And the way we can do that is by going over to the custom layers, custom text and masks, that's the keyword, drop that down. And here we have 15 slots to put in whatever solids we want to use. Now, if we unshy the layers and see how many we have, It starts at 2, 24, what is that? That's 23 layers, so there's not enough room for all of those. But that's fine because we're gonna be duplicating this either way and make multiple copies of it, because Element has a limit as to how many elements you can control individually within each copy of the element effect. So you can see it says group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that means we can have 5 individual objects that we can control with each element instance. So on this first instance, we'll set the first layer to base, then we'll do top orange, bottom red, we'll do line, and then we'll also do the she-wolf base and the kids. And we'll also select all of these for now and just disable them because we don't need to see them moving forward, and hide all layers. Now we'll jump into the scene setup, which is where all the magic happens. To get started, we'll hit the extrude button, which creates a 3D object based on the custom path that we set down here. And these relate to all of the custom path slots that we set before. So for the base, we'll set it to custom path 1. You can also adjust these windows to make some more room if you want. And now before we start duplicating this and creating all the other shapes, let's just scroll down here where it says optimize mesh under the surface options. You can also click these buttons up here, by the way. So if you click this, it'll scroll automatically to that place. Go here, it scrolls up to the transform. But we just want to check this optimize mesh. If you look up here where it says vertices, it goes from almost 4,000 to almost 1,000. So we just want to save as much on performance as possible. Then we'll drop down this arrow to access the material for this object. And under the bevel here, if we zoom in, you can see this object has a bit of a bevel around the edges. And that's nice, it helps catch the light a bit better. But one of the issues is if we go over to the front view and increase the bevel size, you can see it expands the contours of the logo, which is not what we want because that would mess up with the logo design. Now there are workarounds. So for example, if you set the bevel size to 1, you can actually set the expand edges to -1, brings that logo back to whatever it was. So if we go over to the front view, this is without expanding the edges inwards, and then this is with. And if we compare this, that's the before and that's the after adding the bevel. But seeing as the concept behind these logo animations is a very flat looking pastel design, I'm not gonna bother adding bevels at all, so we'll set the bevel depth and the bevel segments down to 0. And the reason I'm doing these and the optimize mesh options is because now we can just duplicate this and all of those other objects are gonna have the same settings. So we'll go right click, duplicate model, we'll rename this one to base by double clicking on it, so hit OK. Then we can double click here and we'll do top orange, hit OK. And now what we have to do is scroll all the way at the top and switch this to custom path 2. If we hide the base by clicking this button, you can see the shape of the top orange part. Now, when it comes to lining up these objects so that they match the logo design, there are 2 ways we can go about it. One is to position all of these in the scene setup, which is the more efficient way of doing things. Or we could leave all of these at the default world position, which is right at the center, and then position them in the composition itself. Let's just hold down Shift and select all of these one by one, and then click and just drop them out of the group. You can see a red line pops up. And now we can set all of these layers into their individual groups. So let's say we have the right kid at group 1, and then the left kid at group 2, and then we'll shut off everything else and just turn off the groups for everything else as well, and also this group at the top. Then we can hit OK, and you can see they pop up in the composition. We can turn off the transparent grid. And over in the group 1, for example, if we go over to create group null, we can hit the create button, which creates a 3D null and makes sure that everything, when it comes to the position, scale, rotation values, they are all linked to these values. So if we move the 3D null, the 3D object moves with it. And sure, we can use the null to position this and maybe match the logo. So if we turn this on, and by the way, we're at the front view right now, so we can't really see whatever objects that are not 3D. So we have to turn this into a 3D layer. So now we can use that as reference and maybe zoom in here and then just grab this and just move it around and try to match the size and all that stuff. But that's a bit of a hassle, I would say. So we can Control Z, undo that, bring it at the center, maybe even go over to the position, right click, reset that, and we'll hide the Roma logo. And we'll go back to the element and we'll just delete the null that we created. And we'll drop these down and go back into the scene setup. Instead, we'll line everything up in the scene setup itself, and then once we go back to the composition, all we have to do is start animating. But of course, in order to be able to do that inside of the scene setup, we're gonna need an image of the logo itself to use as reference. So back in Illustrator, we'll grab the rectangle tool, and then click at the top here where it's gonna snap right at the corner, and then hold down Shift and drag it up until it snaps right at the bottom. So we got a 1080 by 1080 square layer, and you can see it's white, but we can move it at the bottom. And also with it selected over in the Align tab, we can align it at the center. Now we can select the entire Roma layer, and then just as before, File, Export Selection, rename this to Roma Reference, set the destination, set the scale, and hit Export Asset. Now back in Element, we can hit Create and then create a plane, which just adds a square plane right in the scene. And you can see why I decided to go with a square image, so that when we apply it to this plane model, we don't have to worry about any dimension issues where the logo might stretch or anything like that. So we'll double click on the material, rename this to Reference, hit OK. Then under the Diffuse, we can click that and load the texture that we just exported, which is the Roma reference image. Hit Open and then hit OK. It is laying flat on the ground though, so we can hit E to bring up the rotation tool and select the X-axis, if I'm not mistaken, that's the red circle there. Hold down Shift as you're rotating and then it'll snap to 45 degrees. Then we can hit W to bring up the Move tool and then bring it in front a bit. And at this point we can actually bring all of these layers back inside of the group. And by having everything inside of one group, you can see them all at once. We'll select the material itself, scroll down all the way at the bottom, I'll just hit the Advanced button. We'll set the opacity to 50% so we can see through it. And then we'll switch over to Front View and just hit R to bring up the Scale tool, hover over here and just click and drag until the image matches the size of the objects behind. We actually have to move it down a bit as well. I don't know why that is, but we want to line this up as best as possible. By the way, you may notice that the image is a bit blocky, and that's because draft textures are turned on. So if we turn that off, we have a much cleaner looking image. For now though, let's just hide the reference and go back to coloring these up. We'll start off with the base. We'll shut off everything else and we'll select the base, go into the material, and we'll double click on this and we'll do dark gray. Hit OK. Now, how will we go about copying the same colors over? Well, we could go over into Illustrator. Then drop down the base, for example, and select it. And over here where it says color, we can double click on this box, which is the fill color. And we can simply copy the code here, which apparently is pure black, but we'll hit OK. And back in Element, we can scroll down until we find the diffuse color, click on that, and then just select this code and Control V to paste. It is pure black and we want to be able to see the shape of this a bit better. So we'll lighten it up a bit and then hit OK. And also turn down the glossiness to 0% because we want this to have a matte finish. Then moving over to the top orange, we can right click, duplicate and replace, which creates a duplicate of the same material and then adds it to this layer. And you can see it popped up right here where we have our scene materials. We can double click here and rename this to top orange, hit OK. Back in Illustrator, we'll do the same thing. So we'll select the top orange, double click the fill color and just hit Control C to copy the color code and paste it into the diffuse color. As for the line, we'll leave the same material as is. And now we'll take a look at the she-wolf and the kids. So we'll turn all of these off so that you can focus on those. And we'll turn on the she-wolf. And first of all, we just want to right click here and duplicate and replace. And we'll call this she-wolf, hit OK. We'll scroll back up and under textures, just like we did with the plain reference image, click on the diffuse slot and load the she-wolf that we exported from Illustrator. Hit open and hit OK. Now you're not gonna be able to see much here, so that's because the diffuse color is very dark. So we'll set this back to white. And now we have this huge mess. In order to fix the mapping on the object, we're gonna select the layer itself and then scroll down here until we see the UV mapping and just make sure the texture mapping mode is set to box. And what this does is it applies the image based on the bounding box of the 3D model, and seeing as both the model and the image itself have the same resolution, the same bounding box, it's gonna fit perfectly in there. Now, sure, we do have the problem where the side here is all stretched up and weird, but we're gonna fix that in a moment. Now on to fixing these edges. We'll select the right kid and hit Ctrl D to duplicate, and we'll call this right kid outline. Then under the material, we'll add the dark gray and then select the material itself. And if we go back up, you can see there's an option that says bevel outline. which we can enable. And if we turn off the right kid, you can see what's happening here. So without it on, we have the entire shape filled in, and with it on, it creates an outline around the object. And then you can use the outline width to just increase the thickness of that. Now what we can do is create a new group and rename this to right kid and bring in both of these layers. And then we'll turn on the right kid. Now, of course, you may be noticing some edges here. So the way we can fix that is by hitting R and just scale it up just a bit. Now, of course, we do need to be careful with how much we extrude this outline because, again, if we go overboard with it, we're gonna change the silhouette, which is then not gonna match with the logo design. So we'll lower it down just a bit, and that's pretty much the process. All we need to do now is repeat the same thing for the she-wolf and the left kid. Now we can finally move on with having this set up so it matches the logo design. So we'll turn the reference image back on and we'll switch back to the front view. Then we'll select the she-wolf and maybe put this into position, maybe zoom in here, line it up like that. There you go. All right, so I went ahead and positioned everything into their own place. So in the animation, what I want to do is have this as an actual outline instead of a filled in shape. So you can see there is no hole inside of the logo. So what we can do is go into the material and use the same thing as we did with the she-wolf and the kids, enable the bevel outline feature. Now let's quickly hide all the other layers and just leave the base. Go back into the front view, turn the reference image back on. And now we can just increase the outline width, hit R to bring up the scale tool and then scale it down. In fact, we could have actually extruded the outline shape in Illustrator itself so that we don't have to use the bevel outline feature at all. We're actually gonna do that real quick. So let's go back to Illustrator. All right, so we'll start off by creating duplicates of all of these. So we'll select them, click and drag them. Then we'll disable the original ones for a moment. Next up, we'll select top orange, bottom red, and line, group them by hitting Ctrl G, and then we'll select the base, hold down Ctrl, select the group, and finally hit this button, which is the minus front. And what that's gonna do is punch a hole inside of this base layer based on the inner layers. Of course, the line was intersecting with the actual base, so we can go in here, hit A to bring up the direct selection tool, then we can click here, and we'll just delete these points, go over to the other side, delete those points, click P to bring up the pen tool, and then with that point selected, we'll just close it. Rename this to outline, and with it only selected, we'll click the push button. Now back in After Effects, we can see it popped up. We'll unshy all the layers. Now we'll go over to the base and duplicate it just so we can keep it as a backup. So this is gonna be base original, whereas this one is gonna be base outline. Hit M to bring up the mask path, and we'll duplicate this because we're gonna need 2 masks, and then scroll back up. Sorry if I'm moving a bit too fast here, but we've already done this. Now we can go over to the contents, outline, path. Just gotta know which one this is. This is the inner part, so we'll copy that at the bottom mask, and this one at the top mask, and just make sure that we close both of these masks. Now if we go back into the scene setup, and inside the base, we can turn off the bevel outline and bring this back to 0. And also make sure we didn't change the scale. So we'll set this back to 100. And we'll reset the position as well. And just make sure that that is sitting perfectly inside there. There you go. All right, now let's also hide these grids because they can be annoying sometimes. And now let's start making adjustments to the extrusion of each layer. So we'll select the base and we'll hit R. And I want this to be a bit thicker on the Z axis. And then we'll bring them in front, the characters at the top. And then finally, we also have the line here. So we want to bring that in just so slightly so we can see it. Another thing you could do if you're going to be seeing the backside in the animation is actually duplicate the base. And then let's say set the custom path to number 15, I don't know. And we'll do this back base, hit OK. And then we'll go back into the comp and just make sure we select the base original, which is the filled in shape. And once we go back into the scene setup, you can see that this back base layer is now using that custom path. And we can just hit W, bring it at the back, hit R, scale it down a bit, and just W again and just put it in there. Put it in there. Okay. You can scale it down just a bit so it fits at the back there. And in fact, we can select the base, scale it up even more. All right, now let's start separating these. So the she-wolf, the left kid, and the right kid are gonna be their own elements. So we'll click and drag them out of the group. As for the base, we'll just rename this group to base. and we'll leave all of those elements inside one group. So we'll set this one to group 1, she-wolf to group 2, left kid is going to be group 3, and then right kid is going to be group 4. All of these are going to be able to be controlled separately inside of After Effects. By the way, one quick thing, this line here seems way too thin, so I'll hit R and just scale it up a bit in the y-axis. Another thing we can do is drag the reference out of that group and just make sure it's turned off and it's not set to any group, so we can just click there and just disable it. That's actually very important because you don't want to have two objects in the same group because that will cause problems back in After Effects. All right, now let's close the scene setup by hitting OK. Now we can go to Layer, New Camera, and we'll do a very wide angle lens, maybe even 10 millimeters, 2-node camera, and then hit OK. Now let's make sure we switch to the active camera view. And then you can hit C to bring up the orbit tool. And if you go over here in the newer versions of After Effects, you can click and hold on that. And then you'll see 3 options, which are the orbit around cursor tool, scene tool, and camera point of interest, which is the one we want. And now if we click and drag around, we're gonna be able to see the logo from different angles. We'll also create a new light, ambient light, 100% intensity, and hit OK. We just want flat looking lighting so that the colors don't shift too much from the original logo design. However, we will be using ambient occlusion, which if we select the Element3D layer and go down to the render settings, we can find it under the ambient occlusion tab. An Element provides 2 types of ambient occlusions, which is screen space ambient occlusion and ray traced. We want to do ray traced and then say lower down the intensity to 0.7, so it's not as dark. And then scroll down, we can maybe even set this to preview for now so we can work a bit faster. All right, now let's go ahead and implement all the other elements such as the letters and the numbers. And the way we can do that is by duplicating the element effect. Because remember, in order to be able to control everything separately, they need to be in their own group, but the element effect has a maximum of 5 groups, so we can only have 5 separate objects at once. But in order to work around that, what we can do is go down into the render mode, and Element has this unified feature, which basically allows us to use multiple instances of the element effect at once. So now we can rename this to base and characters, and then this one to Roma. Now, before we go into the scene setup, let's just make sure we choose the correct path layers. So we won't touch these ones. We'll just start from path layer 8 and set this to R. Then we'll do R shadow. Go back to the scene setup, and I'll just choose one of these existing models. So for example, the she-wolf, I'll delete the outline and I'll delete the other ones as well. And I'll just rename this to R and just make sure we set it to custom path 8, which is the R letter. And also apply the top orange material. We can even rename this group for now to Roma. We won't delete the base, however, because we want to use it as reference just to see how these letters are intersecting with the base itself. But we will use the reference image to determine the position of all of these letters. Anyway, back to the Roma letters, we'll duplicate this. We'll do our shadow, hit OK. We'll do custom path 9, and we'll add the dark gray to that. You'll notice that they are intersecting, and that's fine, but we'll worry about that in a moment. Now let's just keep duplicating these. So select both of them, duplicate them, bring them at the bottom, and we'll do O, O shadow, and so on and so forth. As you can see, I created instances for each letter and their shadows and put them into their own groups. Now we can select the shadows by holding down Shift and then just bring them back just a bit so they don't intersect. In fact, I wanted them to be just behind the letters themselves. Think of it in the context of the logo design. So the shadow is technically going to be right behind these. It's not some sort of extra bevel of the letters. It's just a shadow being cast. Then we'll turn on the reference image and import it into the Roma group so we can actually see them all at once. And we'll go over into the front view, and now we'll start adjusting all of these letters. So we'll select all of them, bring them down here. And once you line those up, now we can also select the shadows one more time and just bring them down. Now we can bring this Roma layer into the base layer so we can render them all at the same time, just so we can see where they are all sitting. You can select all of these letters, maybe push them in a bit. They may be a bit too extruded. I don't want them to go outside of the outline here. So we're gonna have to scale them in a bit. Now there is a slight issue here when we have all of them selected at once. They don't just scale down in the Z-axis, they all scale up proportionally. So I don't know why that is, but I'm gonna have to go inside of here and just scale those down individually. So we can unlock the scale values and then use these 50%, and we'll copy that value and paste it across. Then we can select them again, bring them in. Then we'll click and drag that out of the base and we'll disable it, turn it off, and we'll also start bringing those letters outside of the Roma group as well. And then we'll assign the letters to the individual groups and hit OK. Now let's go ahead and duplicate this one more time and just make sure that this copy is now set to unify. And then at the bottom copy of the element effect, we'll rename this to 1927 and just make sure that we switch these to whatever we need. So it's the same amount of numbers as there are letters. So it's going to be very convenient. So 1 and then back into the scene setup. Then we need to grab the colors for the numbers from Illustrator. So under the numbers here, we'll select one of them, double click on the color and just copy the color code. And then we'll go under the number here, right click, duplicate and replace. And we'll call this number, hit OK. Scroll down and set the diffuse color to the code we copied. Then we can just add this to each of these numbers. Once again, let's put them in the group so we can start positioning them. All right, so that's looking all fine and dandy. We can now just select these and bring them off the group one more time. We'll disable the base with the reference and then assign these to the groups. Looking nice, looking good, looking fresh. But it's not rendering quite fast though, is it? All right, for the time being, we'll switch this to quarter, go down at the bottom. We'll even turn off the ambient occlusion. And then all the way at the top, under group 1, group utilities, create group null, we can hit create, which will create a 3D null that has all of those elements within that group linked to the null. So we can rename this to base. And if we move this around, you can see that it is indeed moving the base. We can even rotate it on the Z-axis, X-axis, whatever we want. So let's Control Z to go back and continue doing the same thing with all the other elements. All right, so I went ahead and created nulls for each of these groups. And as you can see, if I select the she-wolf, I can move it around. Same with the numbers and the letters. But you may notice that there is a slight problem. The anchor point of all of these nulls is right here at the center, which means everything is gonna scale and rotate from that single point. So if you select all of those, hit S to bring up the scale, you can see they're all scaling up from that single point. So let's Control Z and undo. And what we can do is start adjusting the anchor point. So for example, we'll select the R letter, hit Y to bring up the anchor point tool or the pan behind tool, and just start moving this to the left and then down. In fact, we can go over to the front view so we don't accidentally put it somewhere we don't want to. And let's say around there, and we'll do the same thing for the rest of the nulls. Once the anchor points have been adjusted, we can maybe switch to 2 views and leave this one on the front or the default camera view. As for this one, we'll switch this back to left, and then we'll select the left kid and the right kid and just bring it over in Z space just a bit in front so they render on top of the she-wolf. And then we'll select just the left kid and move it over a bit, just so they don't intersect with each other. Now we'll go back to one view and switch this to active camera. Then we'll select the Element3D layer. And what I wanted to do was to go down under the physical environment, which is basically the HDRI. And we'll set the lighting influence down to 0%. So there's no effect on our colors. Then we can also turn on the ambient occlusion. And of course, we can see the ambient occlusion in action around the contours of the characters and the letters and the numbers, but not so much around the outline. And that's because the outline itself is already pretty dark. So I guess we're gonna have to go back into the scene setup of the base and characters. We can select the dark gray material, scroll down a bit, and then just increase the color just a little bit. And now it's a bit brighter, and we're able to notice the ambient occlusion a bit better. Of course, you can also go down here and play around with the settings of the spread and max distance. So for example, if we increase the max distance, the ambient occlusion is going to spread out even more, and then decrease the spread maybe. So we have a much more contained ambient occlusion, but I'm going to leave these back to default and you can just play around with the intensity of the ambient occlusion. So maybe we'll pump this up to 0.8. I don't want it to be too dark or too contrasty. Maybe we could even select the ambient light, hit A twice, so AA, which brings up the light options, and we can set the intensity to 150. Of course, we do want to make sure that this is set back to 100% all the way at the end, once this becomes a flat logo. And speaking of this becoming 2D, let's get to the animation part, which is pretty much the most fun part after all of this setup. First of all, I want to select all of these layers and parent them to the base. And seeing as the base's anchor point is right there at the bottom, when we scale this down, they're all going to scale down with it. So let's go over to quarter resolution, maybe even set this to draft as we're animating. So draft basically means it doesn't take any lighting into account. So we'll start off with the scale of the entire base logo. Let's say go to 10 frames or so. We can actually hold down Alt and use the scroll wheel to zoom in the timeline, or even use this button right here. And we'll set a keyframe right here. This is the final position. We'll hold down Shift, click R to bring up the rotation. And let's see, what do we want to do? We want to set a keyframe for the X rotation. Yep. So we'll set a keyframe for that as well. Then we can hit U to only show animated stopwatches. So whatever stopwatches we have on. Then we'll go back a bit, set a keyframe for the scale. Then go back a bit more, set a keyframe for both the scale and rotation. We'll set this to 1%. Then on the second keyframe, we want this to overshoot a bit. So we'll do like 110. And then it comes back down to the original size. Now, if we zoom in here, maybe we'll have it start right at the beginning. And we'll hold down Shift and page down to move forward by 10 frames. We'll bring this over here. Then we'll do Shift, page down twice to move forward by 20 frames. And we'll bring these all the way over here. And then we'll select all of them, hit F9 to easy ease them. And then we'll right click on the scale keyframe, go to keyframe velocity, and we'll set this to my favorite number when it comes to easing, 75%, and hit OK. We'll do the same thing for the X rotation as well. We have that a quick preview. It's not looking quite good, but right click keyframe velocity and make the incoming to 50%. The original animation that I worked on took me about 20 or 30 minutes, I think, just because I was fiddling around with the timing of the keyframes and the easing and all that stuff. Now we can bring this keyframe right over here so we can see what the rotation is doing. And we'll do something like, I don't know, maybe 45 degrees. And we'll bring it back over. Let's see, so whoop. And you see how much the wide angle lens of the camera is doing, just making this look a lot more distorted and interesting. In fact, let's just bring the rotation right over here so it doesn't take too long to orient itself towards the camera. Okay, that looks great. By the way, one quick tip is to go back to the Element3D. We'll set keyframes for the enable features. Then with the layer selected, we can hit U to bring up all the keyframes available. And then we can start disabling things that we don't need. So we can just set these to off so they don't distract us, and it takes less time to render as well. Now scroll back up, we'll select the She-Wolf null, hit S to bring up the scale, hold down Shift, hit R to bring up the rotation while also keeping the scale visible. Then we'll hit the stopwatch here and the stopwatch there. Yeah, X rotation and scale. And we want to give it pretty much the same kind of movement, so it scales up with a bit of bounce, so it overshoots a bit, and then it comes back down to its original size while also rotating. So these are the end keyframes. We'll go back, set a keyframe there, go back, set a keyframe there, and we'll actually do one more for the scale, and then we'll set the rotation keyframe. Now for the scale, we'll set it to 0, move forward, we'll scale it up so it overshoots a bit, maybe 110. And then on this keyframe, it actually undershoots a bit, so 95%, and then it comes back up. So now we can F9 those and start playing around with the timing. So we'll do 10 keyframes. Remember, you hold down Shift and page down. You bring these over. Then we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bring this over, and then another 10. Then for this last one, we'll do 75%, and this one 75% as well. I should point out that you don't have to do the same things I'm doing. You can play around with the animation and do whatever you want. It's all up to you. And trust me, it takes a lot of trial and error to get to the point you want. Don't stress about it, just keep working at it, and eventually you'll end up with something you're happy with. Anyway, we'll select the last keyframe. I don't actually want to ease the first one. I just want it to start rotating immediately. So we'll just give this 75%. And then on this one, I just want to rotate it by 45 degrees. So now let's just see how that looks. Actually, I want to give it even more rotation. And here's another cool tip. If you want to change this keyframe value while also seeing how it looks like after it's changed, but at this point in time, for example, well, you can leave your timeline here and then double click on the keyframe, which opens up the tab to adjust it, and maybe say set this to 90 instead. So you can see that's a bit more exaggerated. I actually want this rotation to be done. Maybe even ease this one. All right, now you may be thinking that we have to do the same kind of thing to all of these other elements. Well, not quite. All we can do is just select all of these keyframes, hit Ctrl+C to copy, and then select all the other layers. Just make sure you're at the same keyframe as this, and then we'll hit Ctrl+V to paste. And now if we hit U, you can see that they have the exact same keyframes. By the way, we can go back down here and just make sure we're on the keyframes that we set, and we'll set these back to on. And that's looking fine, but of course we need to offset the timing a bit. And there's a really cool feature in After Effects that allows us to automate the offsetting. What we can do is just select the numbers, for example, and we'll hold down Alt, open square bracket, which trims the layer there. You can also just click and drag the outer side of this layer and then hold down Shift to snap it. And then depending on how much we want to shift these layers from each other, that's how long we need to have these be. So for example, if you want to shift these by 3 frames each, we can go over by 1, 2, 3, hold down Alt, close square bracket, and then because we want to have the number 1 pop in first and then the number 9 to 7, we want to select the number 1 first, hold down Shift, select number 7, and then right click, Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers, and hit OK. And you can see they have all been shifted by 3 frames each, and this doesn't really matter, you can leave it as is, because they're not being used to render the actual elements. But if we just preview this, you can see how they come in one at a time. Maybe offset them by 2 frames each. See, I use the Keyframe Assistant feature and then manually adjust the timing as well. Now we'll do the same thing for the other elements. I'll just do it by hand because there's not too many layers. And then the characters at the top as well. So we'll have the she-wolf come in first, then it's the right kid after 3 frames, and then 1, 2, 3. I'm offsetting these characters based on how they stack on top of each other. And now finally we can select all of these layers apart from the base, and we'll just bring it in just a bit so they actually start popping up a bit earlier. But of course we also need to make sure that this ends up looking flat all the way at the end. And a quick and easy way to do that would be to just create a new null object. We'll turn this into a 3D layer and we'll rename this to extrude. Then we'll parent the base to the extrude and then hit S, unlink the scale. And now if we set this to 1, for example, you can see they all get intruded. Anyway, we do need to make sure that we animate this extrusion. So we'll hit the stopwatch on the scale and we'll go back, find a keyframe, maybe from this point on where they are all scaled up. So at frame 15, we'll bring the keyframe there. Then we'll move over to say 2 seconds and we'll bring this back to 1%. And then we'll select both of them, hit F9 to easy ease them. We'll set this one to actually 100%. So it really quickly starts intruding. All right, that's looking pretty nice, but I think it's a bit too fast actually, so just make sure you play around with the timing because the whole point of turning these logos into 3D elements is so we can see the 3D-ness of it. Like for example, right here, the she-wolf is a bit too thin, so I would go back into the scene setup and make it even thicker. But I guess it also has to do with the fact that we don't have ambient occlusion, so it's looking pretty flat. So we'll go back to say preview mode, and now we have much more definition and depth. Another thing I forgot to do is to have the ambient light go back to 100%. So we'll set a keyframe here, then go back to 2 seconds, set it back to 100. Actually, we can match the timing with the extrude layer. So something like that. And now a few final touches to clean everything up because we can see the samples are a bit low on the ambient occlusion, so we have some noise here. We also have some aliasing around these edges. And to fix those, we'll go down right at the bottom. We'll set this to full render first of all, and we'll go down to output. We'll set the multi-sampling to 16 and then the super sampling to 4. Then all the way at the top under the ambient occlusion, we can set the samples to 8 and then also increase the multi-sampling to say 2. And now all of those aliasing issues are gone and we have a smooth looking ambient occlusion. Oh, and by the way, if you notice that the ambient occlusion is still affecting the colors at the end, even though they're very thin at this point, but if we zoom in here and maybe turn off the ambient occlusion, I don't think it's doing much. Anyway, my point is you can actually animate the intensity value to have it go down to 0. So starting from this point, we can set a keyframe here, go back here. We don't really need any ambient occlusion at this point, so we'll just set it down to 0 and then hit U, and we can even ease these. Just something to keep in mind. Another thing you could do is maybe turn on the motion blur, and if we go back at this point where we have some more movement, you'll be able to see the motion blur of these objects. Be careful, because if you don't have enough samples, you're gonna be able to notice this onion issue. So to fix that, you can go down into the element effect and you'll be able to find motion blur and set the samples to something like 18 maybe. It does say here that the motion blur is using comp settings, but when it comes to samples, it really isn't. It's just using the shutter angle of the comp settings. So if you just right click composition settings, go over to the advanced tab, these samples per frame don't do anything to the element layer, but the shutter angle does control the amount of motion blur. So if we set this to, say, 360 and hit OK, then the motion blur becomes more intense. But we'll Control Z to undo. Oh, and just be careful not to cut your logo off. So you can see right there at the top, it kind of cuts off. So hit P to bring up the position and just decrease this just a little bit. Now finally, we can hit Control M to add it to the render queue, set the output module format to, say, QuickTime with RGB alpha so it has a transparent background, set the destination, and finally hit render. Alright guys, so we're finally done with the Roma 3D logo animation. Now it's time to move on to the other logos and break them down. Moving on to the Barcelona logo, we have pretty much the same process as before. If I unshie all the layers here, you can see all the way at the bottom, I've separated each of these elements into their own solids by copying the masks over from the shape layer that I transferred from Illustrator into After Effects, and then applied these or added these to the Element3D layer under the custom layers section. So if we go up here, custom layers, custom text and masks, you can see all of those elements are present right here. And then same as before, I just went into the scene setup, extruded them, made adjustments to the extrusion, the scale, position, and rotation, and that was pretty much it. Now, there are a few interesting points to talk about when it comes to the Barcelona logo. For one, on the ball element here, I used the same technique as with the she-wolf and the kids, where I exported a single image of the entire ball and then applied that on top of a simple cylinder. You can see it's just a simple cylinder, so when we look at it from the front side, it just looks like a circle or a ball. I'll also show you the way I animated the entire logo rotating. So at the start here, you can see it's just spinning around. And you may be thinking, oh, I just parented everything to this outline base or something. But actually, that's not the case. The logo itself is not rotating. Well, certain elements are, and they are scaling up and down and moving around, sure. But if you see here, there's a 3D null called camera orbit. And if we hit U on that, it'll reveal the Y rotation keyframes. And as you can see, the camera is actually parented to that null. If we say go to this point and then adjust the rotation here, you can see how this is spinning around. And in fact, to see that better, we can go to two views. And on this side, we'll go to top view and then hit Control-Shift-H to show the UI elements. And you can see this is where the camera is. This is where the null is. And now if we go back to 0%, you can see how the camera is rotating. In fact, let's go back to quarter resolution so we can rotate this a bit faster. This outline edge is spinning around at the beginning, but we can't see anything else until we come at this point. And you probably guessed it by now, I just used the enable feature right at this point and just enabled all of the inner elements. And we can see that if we go back to the Element3D layer, hit U on the keyboard, and right here we have all of these enable keyframes. And my favorite part of this logo animation is the ball itself. So if we just scrub through here, you can see that the ball is scaling as it comes up and then bounces on the ground once. And as it bounces, the logo also moves down a bit. So it's kind of affecting the logo as secondary motion, which plays a huge role in making this even more dynamic. So I just animated the actual position of the layer itself. So if I hit P, yep, there it is. So this is what's driving that entire logo bounce. And one final thing, you can see as the ball, let's say, bounces, it actually starts spinning even more. And even though the logo settles in, the ball is still spinning. And that just helps to give it even more interest, so not everything stops at once. Okay, so now let's move on to the next logo. I would say the Arsenal logo animation is my favorite of the bunch. And that's mainly due to the fact that we have this cannon present in the logo design, which of course allows for some very interesting animations. You can see the wheel comes in, kind of bounces, and also affects the logo itself. And just to go back to what we did with the Barcelona logo, you can see this entire logo has a bounce to it, which reacts to the wheel jumping around. And then as the cannon shoots, the logo also rotates or tilts a bit. So if we just select the actual layer, hit R, and then hold down Shift, hit P to bring up the position while also keeping the rotation, you see I just animated the rotation and position of the layer itself. And as you can see down here, the anchor point is set all the way at the bottom there. So when it tilts, it sort of rotates from that bottom point. The Arsenal title all the way at the top here also reacts or comes in as soon as the cannon shoots. And again, I just use the enable feature for that. And then all the way at the end here, once everything starts to settle in, I also have a scale extra end null here. You can see that this Element3D layer is parented to it. And what's happening is it's just slightly scaling down. So even when everything settles in, we still have a bit of zoom out. The individual parts at the beginning here that scale horizontally, I just animated the X scale value. So if we select the base red, white, and blue and hit S, you can see that we're just animating the scale. And I've unlinked the 3 axes here so I can control the axes individually. Oh, and I remembered, you can see how the title is extruding. Well, the front side of this Arsenal title and the back side are 2 separate elements. So if we grab the title front and title, hit S, and then go over to this keyframe, you can see that the back side is scaled less than the front side. So now if we grab this in, we can actually make it even bigger to the point where we can see it at the back side as well. So let's Control Z to undo. And then one last thing before we move on, I have the original Arsenal logo right on top here. So let's just turn that on. If we zoom in here, you can see that this red part at the middle has a brighter red on the left side and then a darker red on the right side. Well, I kind of took the liberty on that and just didn't bother with it because that will mean that we have to have an extra layer of that and things can get complicated. So just for the sake of the tutorial, I decided to skip on that. But anyway, there is that. And now let's move on to the next logo. All right, so seeing as we were on that topic of modifying the actual logo, if we zoom in here, turn on the original Bayern logo, you can see these diamonds at the bottom are filled in, whereas on our logo animation, they are not. And again, it's a simple reason of just not having to bother with all of those details for the sake of the tutorial. Seeing as the Bayern logo is a circle, I just knew I wanted all of these circles to kind of scale up individually from the center and have the letters pop in one by one and finally reveal the diamonds in the center. Now, if we scroll back down, you can see that we actually have 2 layers of Element3D. So we have the circle and characters in one layer, and then the diamonds in another layer. And the main reason for this is because I wanted to isolate the diamonds at the center. Now, see what happens when we turn off the alpha matte. We can actually see the entire diamonds. And when it comes to Element3D, it doesn't have Booleans feature, which you could say there are 3D alpha mattes where you use one object to isolate another object. So to work around that, I just created a simple circle element and turned it into 3D. So if you hit F4 to toggle the switches, you can see that it is 3D. This way I don't have to manually animate it to match the position. It just sticks into the logo. Now if we hit F4 and toggle this back to alpha matte, you can see it isolates those diamonds. As for the diamonds themselves, what I did was to just trace around the original logo because the way the original logo was set up, I couldn't really copy this properly. So I just traced around it and then made some extra rows here past of this cut point and then duplicated that 3 times in Element3D. So we have 3 rows of diamonds. And for some reason, when I first looked at this logo, I just knew that I want to have these diamonds intersect like that, kind of like teeth of a shark biting into something. And then as soon as they intersect or they come into contact, we use the enable feature to show the middle row of the diamonds, which is always there. It's just not visible because we turned it off with the enable feature. By the way, one quick thing I wanted to show you. If we go down here and turn off the alpha matte, you can see that they are somehow still inside of this red ring. And the reason that is because I actually left this circle 3D object in the diamonds element instance as well. So you can see up here it says circle, down here it says spikes, which should be diamonds, but whatever. If we go into the scene setup, you can see we have this grayed out area, and that's because we're using the matte shadow feature in Element, which makes the element not visible to the camera, but it retains the intersections and the shadows that are cast upon this element. And that's mainly why these two are interacting with each other. If I were to turn this off, you can see it's just out in the open, but with it back on, it's actually coming through the red ring. Together with that, we use the alpha matte of the circle just to ensure that further in the timeline here, we get to isolate those properly. All right, now let's move on to the last logo. I left this one for last because I wanted to point out something very important. Not every logo animation has to be contained. What I mean by that is you can make use of the entire frame. And as we can see with this logo, it starts up with a close-up of the flower that just pops out. And then we dolly all the way out to reveal the entire shape of the logo. And apart from the flower here, there are no crazy animations. As we scrub through here, you can see nothing is happening except that they are all intruding inwards and flattening out. So let's go back to the beginning and focus on the flower for now. You can see down here it says flower top, right, left, and bottom. Those are the 3D nulls that control these objects. For the flower top, I set the anchor point right at the bottom here so it scales up from that point, and did the opposite for the bottom flower, which is at the top side. And then for the right flower, I set the anchor point to this side, so the left side of the right flower, and then the opposite for the left flower. Now we can select all of these, hit U to bring up the keyframes, and you can see it's just simple position animations and scale. For some reason, Element distorts objects when you rotate them, while their scale is not proportional in all three axes. So because these flowers are all extruded, which means they are 300 by 300 on the X and Y, but the Z axis scale is 4000. If we hold down Shift, hit R to bring up the rotation, and let's say rotate it in the Y rotation, you can see how it distorts it. And I don't know why that is, but I just know that the reason that happens is because the scale is not proportional. So to work around that, I just went into the Element3D effect, and let's scroll down, let's say find the flower. And now each group has a particle look and particle rotation, which is different from the particle replicator rotation. And you can see these are all red because they are linked by expression to the rotation of the null. I think group 2 should be one of the left or right sides. So yeah, there it is, it's animated. I animated the Z rotation of this because by using this, it doesn't distort the 3D object. So you can see if we increase the Y rotation, it just rotates normally. Again, I don't know why this is an issue, but if you run into this issue, just know that it's because you don't have a proportional scale on the nulls. With that said, let's now move on to the outro. Alright guys, if you're seeing my face right now, it means that you've reached the end of the tutorial, so I'm very thankful for your patience, and I hope this was helpful in one way or another. Again, I challenge you to go grab your favorite team's logo and try to animating by using whatever you've learned today. And if you happen to post it on social media platforms, then make sure to also tag me. Remember to download the project files on my Gumroad page, which again are using the pay what you want system, so you can grab anything you want for free while still having the option to support the channel if you'd like to. If you don't want to miss out on upcoming videos, then make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell to be notified. And with that said, thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.